The wind was a thief in this godless country. It stole the warmth from a person's bones, the moisture from the soil, and the hope from a heart already scraped raw. For Eliza, it was the sound of her own emptiness, a constant, whining reminder of all she had lost. The cabin, once a monument to shared dreams with her husband, Thomas, was now just a wooden tomb on a sea of cracked earth and brittle sagebrush. The sun beat down with a white, indifferent fury, baking the land until it resembled the hide of some great, dead beast. Inside, the air was stale with the ghosts of yesterday, the faint scent of Thomas's pipe tobacco clinging to the curtains, the silence where his heavy footfalls ought to be. Her own hunger was a dull, persistent ache, a hollow space that mirrored the one his absence had carved inside her. Grief had long since burned away her tears, leaving only a brittle resolve to see the sun rise one more time. It was a foolish, pointless resolve, but it was all she had left. The world had shrunk to the four walls of this cabin and the small, struggling garden out back, where the corn stalks stood like withered skeletons. The nearest settlement was a 2-day ride, a place she had no desire to see. They had looked at her with pity after Thomas died, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves, judging her for being unable to keep him, for being a woman alone in a place a woman had no business being. They saw her as a loose thread, a problem to be dealt with. So she remained, a hermit by necessity, her loneliness a physical presence in the small, dusty rooms. Each day was a ritual of survival. She would check the water barrel, its contents shrinking with alarming speed. She would portion out her dwindling supply of flour and dried beans, the act a grim sacrament. She looked at her hands, no longer the soft hands of the woman who had followed her husband west, but calloused, cracked things, monuments to futile labor. Despair was not a wave that crashed over her, it was the very air she breathed, thick and suffocating. She was waiting to die, she realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and strangely calming. She was simply waiting for the wind to stop and the silence to become absolute. Then, he appeared. A shadow detaching itself from the shimmering heat haze. He did not ride a horse or announce his presence with a call. He simply stood at the edge of her cleared yard, as still and silent as the bluffs that loomed in the distance. He was Apache, that much was clear from the line of his jaw and the stark intensity of his gaze. But he was not the fearsome warrior from the settlers' fevered tales. His body was a study in starvation, his cheekbones sharp ridges beneath taut, sun-darkened skin. His buckskins were worn, and he carried no rifle, only a long knife at his belt. He was suffering as this land suffered. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable, and in their depths, Eliza saw not a threat, but a reflection of her own desperate condition. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her apathy, but another feeling rose alongside it, a flicker of something she hadn't felt since Thomas was alive. A terrible, aching kinship. He was the land made flesh, proud, unforgiving, undying. He did not move, did not speak. He simply waited, his presence a silent question posed to the vast, empty sky and to the lone woman in the doorway of the lonely cabin. The silence stretched, pulled taut between them, heavy with the weight of two lives balanced on the knife's edge of survival. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Every instinct, every whispered story from the settlement, screamed at her to bar the door, to grab the old shotgun Thomas had left mounted over the hearth. He was the enemy, the savage, the spectre that haunted the lonely places of this territory. But her body would not obey. She remained rooted to the spot, her gaze locked with his. The man did not move, his patience as vast and unnerving as the landscape itself. His eyes, though hollowed by hunger, held a formidable dignity. He was not begging. He was a chief, she thought, though she could not say how she knew. It was in his stillness, in the way he held himself as if the parched earth beneath his feet was his and his alone. He was making no demand, yet his presence was an undeniable claim on her humanity. She thought of the last of her flour, a pathetic amount in a dusty sack. She thought of the few strips of salted venison hanging in the larder, so dry they were like wood. It was her future, her next few days of life, measured out in mouthfuls. To give any of it away was not charity, it was suicide. Yet, to refuse felt like a deeper kind of death, a final surrender to the hardness this land demanded. It would be the moment she became as cruel and unforgiving as the wind. Her hand trembled as she turned away from the door, leaving it open. The gesture felt monumental, a terrifying act of faith in a world that had given her no reason to trust. Inside, the cabin felt small and close. She moved with a strange, dreamlike deliberation, her actions feeling as if they belonged to someone else. She took down the venison, her hands fumbling with the twine. She scooped the flour into a wooden bowl, her mind a blank slate, scrubbed clean of fear and calculation. She worked by a primal instinct, a recognition that the life standing outside her door was no different from her own. Both were flickering flames in a great and powerful wind, liable to be extinguished at any moment. She mixed the flour with a splash of precious water, her hands working the dough into a small, flat loaf. She laid it in the cast-iron skillet over the embers in the hearth, the smell of baking bread filling the small space with a ghost of better times. She carved 3 thick slices from the venison, her best slices. When the bread was done, she placed it all on a tin plate, the only plate she owned that wasn't chipped. It was a feast. It was everything. Holding the plate before her like an offering, she walked back to the doorway. He had not moved. He watched her approach, his expression unchanged, but she saw a flicker of something in the depths of his dark eyes as he looked down at the food. She stopped a few feet from him and held out the plate. She could not bring herself to speak. The words would be inadequate, foreign things in the vast silence between them. He looked from the plate to her face, a long, searching look that seemed to strip away all her defenses, leaving her soul bare to his scrutiny. He was looking for the poison, she thought, for the trick. Finally, he reached out a hand, his fingers brushing hers as he took the plate. His touch was dry and warm, like sun-baked stone. He did not retreat to the shadows to eat. He sat, cross-legged, in the dirt of her yard, and ate with a slow, deliberate grace that was both painful and beautiful to watch. He ate every last crumb, every morsel of meat. When he was finished, he stood, wiped the plate clean with the side of his hand, and walked back to her. He handed her the empty plate. Their eyes met once more. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then, he turned and walked away, melting back into the shimmering heat from which he had emerged. Eliza stood in the doorway, clutching the empty plate, the scent of baked bread on the air, and for the first time in months, she did not feel entirely alone. She felt terrified, but not alone. Sleep did not come easily that night. Eliza lay on her narrow cot, the old shotgun now resting on the floor beside her, its cold metal a stark contrast to the memory of the stranger's touch. Every creak of the cabin walls, every sigh of the wind, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her. She had been a fool. A sentimental, reckless fool. She had given her last rail meal to a savage who would likely return with his brethren to take the rest. They would find the shotgun, the few tools, the water in the barrel. They would find her. The stories the settlers told played on a loop in her mind, tales of violence, of cruelty, of a people with no mercy. And yet, the image that kept rising to the surface was not of a fearsome warrior, but of a man eating slowly in the dust, his movements conveying a deep and weary dignity. She had seen desperation, not malice. She had seen hunger, not hatred. Or had she only seen what she wanted to see, a reflection of her own lonely state? The night stretched on, an eternity of shadow and sound. When dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and rose, she was exhausted, her nerves frayed to ribbons. She rose, her body stiff and sore, and forced herself into the daily ritual. Check the water. Stare at the nearly empty larder. The hunger was sharper now, a gnawing beast in her belly. She was standing by the window, staring out at the unforgiving landscape, when she saw them. Movement on the horizon. Not one man, but a small procession. Her blood ran cold. It was him. And he was not alone. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a cry. He was returning, just as she had feared. He walked at the head of the group, his stride no longer weary but imbued with a new purpose. And behind him, walking in single file, were 5 figures. As they drew closer, she saw they were women, young Apache women, their faces stoic and unreadable. They carried woven baskets and bundles. Panic seized Eliza, a primal, animal terror that left her breathless. What was this? What fresh horror had her foolish act of kindness invited? The whispers of the settlement came back to her, twisted into a new, monstrous shape. Perhaps he was not here to kill her or to rob her. Perhaps this was something else, something worse. A payment. A trade. Had he brought them for her? The thought was so bizarre, so alien, it made her head spin. Was this some strange custom? A man who is fed returns with women, offerings, brides for the one who showed him mercy? He had seen a lone woman, and he was bringing her companions. No, not companions. Wives. Her mind, starved and terrified, latched onto the most grotesque interpretation. She was being claimed. Her single act of compassion had been mistaken for a proposal, a contract she had unwittingly signed. She stumbled back from the window, her hand fumbling for the shotgun. The world outside, the approaching figures, seemed to waver and distort, seen through a haze of pure fear. They stopped where he had stood the day before, a silent, waiting line. The man, the chief, looked toward the cabin, his gaze steady, expectant. He had brought her 5 young girls to marry him. The thought was a scream in her mind. Her life was over. The shotgun felt heavy and foreign in her hands. Eliza stood just inside the doorway, the thick wood of the door a flimsy shield against the impossible scene unfolding in her yard. The 5 women stood motionless behind the chief, their dark eyes fixed on some point beyond Eliza, their expressions as impassive as carved stone. They were young, some barely older than girls, all of them lean and wiry, radiating a quiet strength that felt both intimidating and ancient. This was not a raiding party. It was a delegation. A ceremony she could not comprehend. Her mind reeled, trying to escape the terrifying conclusion it had reached. A marriage. A life debt repaid in flesh. The chief took a single step forward, raising a hand, palm open, in a gesture that might have been peaceful or might have been a command. Eliza flinched, her finger tightening on the trigger of the shotgun. A single, sharp word from him, and the women might swarm the cabin. Or worse, they might simply wait, their silent, collective patience a weapon more potent than any rifle. The chief said nothing. He simply looked at her, his gaze holding hers, and she saw a flicker of something she couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't lust. It was appraisal. He was measuring her, waiting for her reaction. Slowly, agonizingly, the terror began to recede, replaced by a profound and bewildering confusion. What if she was wrong? Her interpretation was born of her own world, of white men's stories and fears. What if this meant something else entirely? To fire the shotgun now would be an act of war, an answer to a question that had not yet been asked. To bar the door would be to lock herself in her tomb for good. Hesitantly, she lowered the barrel of the gun, though she did not release her grip on it. She took a tentative step out onto the porch, the harsh morning light making her blink. The heat was already building, the air thick and still. She stood there, a lone woman in a faded calico dress, holding a shotgun, facing down an Apache chief and 5 silent women. The absurdity of it was almost enough to make her laugh, a hysterical, broken sound. The chief seemed to take her emergence as a sign. He spoke, not to her, but to the women behind him. His voice was low and guttural, the words utterly alien to her ears. In response, the women moved. Not toward her, but away. They fanned out across her barren yard with a fluid, practiced efficiency that spoke of long habit. One went to the sad, withered garden, her fingers gently probing the dry soil around the base of the corn stalks. Another walked to the well, peering down into its depths, her expression unchanging. 2 others began to walk the perimeter of the small plot of land, their eyes scanning the ground, the brush, the horizon. The last one, the youngest, walked to the pile of wood Eliza had painstakingly chopped and began to methodically sort it, stacking the larger pieces with a neatness Eliza had never bothered to achieve. They were not attacking. They were not waiting to be claimed. They were working. Assessing. Taking inventory of this pathetic, failing homestead. Eliza watched, dumbfounded, the shotgun hanging forgotten at her side. The chief had not brought her wives. He had brought her a workforce. He had seen her solitary, failing struggle, and in return for a single plate of food, he had brought her the one thing she needed more than anything else. He had brought her help. The realization dawned not in a flash, but as a slow, creeping warmth that thawed the ice in her veins. It was a life debt, yes, but not the one her panic mind had invented. It was a debt of survival, to be repaid in kind. He was ensuring her homestead would not fail, because its survival, he seemed to understand, was now tied to his own. The days that followed were a silent ballet of shared space and unspoken negotiation. Eliza woke each morning to find the 5 women already at work, their movements economical and purposeful. They did not speak to her, nor she to them. Language was a chasm between them, but the language of labor became their common ground. The woman in the garden, whose name Eliza mentally christened Willow for her slender grace, seemed to coax life from the dead soil. She found pockets of moisture Eliza had never known existed, clearing weeds with a small, sharp tool made of bone and sinew. The woman at the well, whom Eliza called Stone for her stoic and unyielding presence, devised a new pulley system with rope she fashioned from yucca fibers, making the task of drawing water less of a back-breaking ordeal. The 2 who patrolled the perimeter were her hawks, their sharp eyes missing nothing. They returned one afternoon with 3 plump rabbits, caught in snares Eliza could not even see. The youngest, Sparrow, organized the cabin's interior with a quiet efficiency that bordered on unnerving. She mended Eliza's torn dress with stitches finer than Eliza's own, using a bone needle and thread she had spun herself. Eliza watched them, at first with suspicion, then with a grudging respect that slowly blossomed into awe. They moved with an innate understanding of the land, reading its secrets in the turn of a leaf or the track of an insect. They were not fighting the wilderness, they were a part of it. Her own struggle, her furious, desperate war against the elements, suddenly seemed clumsy and ignorant. She was the outsider here, not them. She kept the shotgun by her bed, but its presence felt increasingly foolish. The real threat was not these silent, capable women, it was the gnawing hunger, the dwindling water, the crushing loneliness. And these women were fighting all of it. One afternoon, while mending a fence post, a splinter of dry wood drove deep into the palm of Eliza's hand. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and dropped her hammer. Before she could even inspect the wound, Willow was at her side. The Apache woman's expression remained impassive, but her movements were gentle. She gestured for Eliza to sit. From a small leather pouch at her waist, she took a pinch of dried leaves and a sharp cactus thorn. Eliza flinched, but Willow's dark eyes held hers, a silent command to be still. With a surgeon's precision, she used the thorn to work the splinter free, a touch surprisingly delicate. Then, she chewed the leaves into a green pulp and pressed the poultice against the bleeding wound. The pain subsided almost instantly, replaced by a cool, clean sensation. Willow wrapped Eliza's hand in a strip of soft buckskin and then, without a word, returned to the garden. Eliza stared at her bandaged hand, a lump forming in her throat. It was the first time anyone had touched her with kindness since Thomas had died. That evening, Eliza did not eat her meager portion alone in the cabin. She took her bowl of watery bean soup and sat on the porch steps. The 5 women were gathered around a small, smokeless fire they had built, sharing the roasted rabbits. They glanced at her, their expressions unreadable, but no one told her to leave. She ate in the growing twilight, the silence no longer feeling empty and threatening, but full and companionable. It was a silence of mutual effort, of shared space. She looked at her bandaged hand, then at the figures around the fire. The chasm between their worlds remained, vast and deep. But for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that a bridge could be built, one silent act of kindness at a time. The chief, Kalen, as she had learned his name was whispered on the wind from one of the hawks to another, did not return. But his presence was felt in the work of the women, in the slow, steady reclamation of her home. They were his eyes, his hands, his promise. A promise that survival was not a solitary endeavor. The homestead transformed under their care. It was a slow, quiet miracle. The garden, once a graveyard of withered stalks, began to show patches of green. Willow had planted beans and squash from seeds she carried, plants suited to this arid soil, and they thrived under her knowing hand. The water barrel was no longer a source of anxiety. Stone had discovered a seep at the base of a rocky outcrop a half-mile away, and they now had a steady, if small, supply of fresh water. The larder, once hauntingly empty, began to fill. The hawks brought in a steady supply of game, and they taught Eliza how to dry the meat in the sun on racks they fashioned from willow branches. They showed her which roots were edible, which berries were sweet, and which leaves could be brewed into a restorative tea. In return, Eliza brought out her own knowledge. She showed them the magic of her steel sewing needles, a marvel to women accustomed to bone awls. A silent trade began. The fine, even stitches of a steel needle for the knowledge of how to tan a rabbit hide until it was as soft as velvet. The utility of a cast iron pot for the secret of finding water in a land of dust. Eliza found herself changing. The brittle shell of grief and despair had cracked, and something new was growing in its place. A quiet competence. A sense of purpose that had nothing to do with being Thomas's widow and everything to do with being herself. She began to anticipate their needs, leaving a bucket of fresh water where Sparrow would find it for her cooking, sharpening the hawk's skinning knives on her whetstone. One evening, she brought out a bolt of blue calico cloth she had been saving, a relic from her past life. She laid it on the rough-hewn table, a silent offering. The women gathered around, their fingers tracing the pattern, their eyes wide with a quiet wonder that transcended language. The next day, Sparrow presented Eliza with a pair of moccasins, stitched perfectly to fit her feet, the soles thick and tough, the beadwork a stunning, intricate pattern of blue and white. Eliza held them in her hands, her throat tight. It was a gift for a gift. An acknowledgement. They were no longer just cohabitants, they were partners in this shared enterprise of life. The silence between them remained, but it was now a comfortable, understood thing. It was filled with the rhythm of shared work, the rustle of Sparrow's mending, the thud of Stone's axe, the soft murmur of the wind, which no longer sounded like a lament, but like a whisper of possibility. One afternoon, Kalen returned. He appeared as he had the first time, a silent figure materializing from the heat. But this time, he was not alone. Two warriors, lean and armed with bows, flanked him at a distance. And this time, he was not starving. He carried a fresh deer slung over his shoulders, a magnificent buck. The 5 women stopped their work and stood, a silent line of respect. Eliza's heart did not pound with fear. It beat with a steady, calm rhythm. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked out to meet him, not with a shotgun, but with an open gaze. He looked past her, at the thriving garden, the repaired fence, the neat stack of firewood. He saw the transformation. His eyes, dark and piercing, came to rest on her face. There was no praise in his expression, no overt acknowledgement, but she saw a flicker of profound satisfaction in their depths. He had made a worthy investment. He swung the deer from his shoulders and laid it at her feet. An offering. A share of his own people's good fortune. Eliza looked down at the magnificent animal, then back at him. "Thank you," she said. The words felt small, inadequate, but they were all she had. He gave that same, almost imperceptible nod he had given her on his first visit. But this time, it felt different. It was not the closing of a transaction, but the sealing of a bond. A treaty written not on paper, but on the hard, dry earth they both called home. He was the chief of his people, and she realized with a jolt, was the matriarch of this strange, silent, resilient little tribe. The prosperity of the small homestead did not go unnoticed. A lone rider from the settlement, a trapper named Silas who sometimes rode the outer territories, passed by one day. He stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth agape at the sight. He saw not the failing hovel of a grieving widow, but a functioning, thriving farm. He saw the green garden, the smoke rising from the chimney, the tanned hide stretched on frames. And he saw the 5 Apache women working alongside Eliza, their movements a synchronized dance of productivity. He saw Eliza, no longer gaunt and haunted, but strong and sure, her face browned by the sun, giving quiet, gestured directions to her companions. What Silas saw, he did not understand. And what he did not understand, he feared. He turned his horse and galloped back toward the settlement, his mind alight with a story that would grow more monstrous with every telling. A story of a white woman bewitched, gone native, living in sin with a pack of savages. A story of an Apache war band using her homestead as a forward base. The seeds of conflict, planted in ignorance and prejudice, had found fertile ground. A week later, they came. Not a lynch mob, not yet, but a grim-faced posse of a dozen men from the settlement, led by the town's self-important magistrate, a man named Henderson. They rode with a purpose that was both righteous and menacing, their rifles held ready across their saddles. They reined in their horses at the edge of the yard, forming a semicircle, a wall of judgment and steel. Eliza and the 5 women were in the garden, harvesting squash. They all looked up, their work stilled by the sudden intrusion. The women's faces became blank masks, their bodies tensed, ready for flight or a fight. Eliza felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach, but she straightened her shoulders and walked toward the men, her hands deliberately empty. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear that fluttered in her chest. "This is an unexpected visit." Henderson, a portly man whose face was flushed with indignation, glared down at her from his horse. "Eliza! We've come out of concern. We heard disturbing reports." His eye swept over the 5 Apache women, his lip curling in distaste. "We heard you were being held here against your will. It was a lie, a pretense for their intrusion, and they both knew it." "As you can see, I am perfectly fine," Eliza replied, her tone cool. "These women are my guests. They are helping me work this land." "Guests?" Henderson scoffed. "These are hostiles, Eliza. It ain't proper. It ain't safe. For you, or for us." "Silas said they've taken over the place." "Silas was mistaken," Eliza said, her voice like flint. "This is my land. Thomas and I worked it, and now I work it. I will choose who helps me." A murmur ran through the men. A woman talking back, a woman defending them. "It was unnatural." "That ain't your choice to make," another man, a hard-faced farmer named Jed, snarled. "You're a danger to us all, letting them live here. We're here to run them off. And you're coming back with us. For your own good." He began to dismount, his intent clear. The 5 women behind Eliza did not move, but they drew closer together, their hands gripping their harvesting tools. A bone knife. A sharpened digging stick. They were meager weapons against rifles, but their eyes burned with a fierce, protective loyalty. The air grew thick, shimmering with imminent violence. This was it. The moment her small, peaceful world would be shattered by the ignorance of others. She had survived starvation and loneliness only to be destroyed by the very people who claimed to be her own. Just as Jed's boots hit the ground, a new presence made itself known. Not with a sound, but with a sudden, collective shift in the posse's attention. Their eyes darted to the rocky bluffs that overlooked the homestead. There, outlined against the harsh blue sky, stood Kalen. And he was not alone. 10 warriors stood with him, silent and motionless, their bows in their hands, arrows narked. They had appeared from nowhere, specters of the rock and sun. They made no threatening gesture, uttered no war cry. Their silent, watchful presence was more terrifying than any shout. It was a statement. Henderson's face went pale. His men froze, their bravado evaporating in the face of this new reality. They had come expecting to intimidate a lone woman and a few squaws. They had not expected to face the full, silent wrath of an Apache war chief. Kalen's gaze was not on the posse. It was on Eliza. He was waiting. Waiting for her signal. The power in that moment was absolute, and it belonged entirely to her. She could unleash a storm of violence with a single word or gesture. The men from the settlement saw it, too. They saw that she was not a victim, not a prisoner. She was the linchpin. Eliza held that power for a long, silent beat. She looked at Henderson's fearful face, at Jed's hand frozen on the stock of his rifle. She could have her revenge for their whispers, their pity, their judgment. but she saw only their fear, a mirror of the same fear she had once felt. Violence would solve nothing. It would only prove them right. She turned her back on them, a deliberate, dismissive gesture, and faced Kalen on the bluff. She raised her hand, not in a signal to attack, but in a slow, open-palmed wave of acknowledgement. A greeting. Then she let it fall to her side and looked back at Henderson. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried across the yard with absolute authority. "This is my home," she said. "And these are my people. You are not welcome here." Leave for a moment, no one moved. The tension was a physical thing, a wire stretched to its breaking point. Henderson stared at her, then up at the silent figures on the bluff, then back again. He saw no weakness in her, no room for negotiation. He saw a woman who had made her stand, defended by a force he did not dare to challenge. Wordlessly, he swung himself back onto his horse. "Let's go," he muttered to his men. They needed no further encouragement. They turned their horses and rode away, not with the swagger of a righteous posse, but with the hurried retreat of men who had stumbled into something far older and more powerful than they could comprehend. As the dust of their departure settled, Eliza looked back up at the bluff. Kalen and his warriors were gone, melted back into the rock and the heat. But she knew they were watching. They would always be watching. She was no longer alone. In the quiet aftermath, the homestead seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The 5 women, their bodies still humming with the tension of the confrontation, slowly relaxed. Sparrow, the youngest, looked at Eliza with an expression of awe that broke through her usual stoicism. The hawks gave a curt, respectful nod before resuming their patrol of the perimeter, their eyes scanning the horizon for any lingering threat. The air, cleared of the posse's hostile presence, felt clean again. Eliza walked to the porch and sank onto the steps, her knees suddenly weak. She had faced down her own people and chosen a new family, a silent, unlikely clan bound not by blood, but by shared hardship and mutual respect. Later, as dusk painted the sky in soft, bruised colors, Kalen came down from the bluffs. He walked into the yard alone, carrying nothing. He stopped before her, his face inscrutable in the fading light. He had put his life, and the lives of his men, in her hands. He had trusted her judgment. She had not failed that trust. There were no words for the gratitude, the understanding that passed between them. Language was still a barrier, but it no longer seemed to matter. He had seen her stand her ground, not as a frightened widow, but as the mistress of her domain. She had seen him not as a savage, but as a guardian, a leader who protected his own with a silent, unwavering strength. He gestured toward the distant settlement, a question in his eyes. Would they return? Eliza met his gaze and shook her head slowly. No. They would not return. Their fear was now greater than their prejudice. She had drawn a line in the dust, and he had consecrated it with his presence. He gave his familiar, subtle nod of acceptance. This small patch of land, once a symbol of her grief and isolation, had become a sanctuary, an island of peace in a hostile world. It was a testament to the fact that strength was not about hardness, but about the resilience to remain open, to offer kindness in the face of desolation. Her single, desperate act of giving food to a starving stranger had not brought her ruin, but salvation. It had returned to her 100-fold, not in gold or silver, but in loyalty, in purpose, in life itself. As the first stars began to prick the velvet darkness of the sky, Eliza knew she was no longer just surviving. She was home. And she would never be alone again.